The Irvine Company owns approximately 93,000 acres in Orange County, California, roughly one-fifth of the entire county, and it has never gone public, never sold a controlling interest to an outside investor, and never subjected its land to the kind of debt structure whose maturity date would force a sale. That is not an accident. It is the entire strategy. Donald Bren, who acquired control of the Irvine Company in 1977, and has since become its sole owner, built one of the largest private fortunes in American history through a real estate ownership model that inverts almost every financial assumption. This channel has spent 93 case files documenting as the mechanism of institutional failure, instead of leveraged acquisition, patient accumulation, instead of exit-oriented return extraction, permanent income generation, instead of debt that matures and forces decisions, financing structured to never require a sale. The forensic entry point for this case is the permanent mortgage, not as a specific loan instrument, but as a philosophy, the deliberate structuring of a real estate portfolio's debt, so that no individual loan maturity, no refinancing cycle, and no credit market disruption can force the sale of an asset that the owner intends to hold permanently. The Irvine Company's financial structure is not fully disclosed because it is a private company. What is documented in the public record is the outcome: a 9,300-acre holding whose development across 50 years has produced the single most valuable privately held real estate portfolio in the United States without a bankruptcy filing, a distressed sale, a hostile takeover, or a forced divestiture at any point in the portfolio's history. The failures this channel documents are produced by the forced sale the moment when debt maturity, covenant breach, or financial crisis requires an asset to be sold at a time and price the owner would not choose absent the obligation. The Irvine Company has spent 50 years engineering the conditions under which that moment cannot occur. Subscribe now, because this is the case file that most precisely explains what the alternative to every failure this channel has documented actually looks like at the scale of a continent-sized landholding. Orange County, California was not always the most valuable real estate market in the United States. In 1864, when James Irvine assembled the original land holding from Mexican land grants and purchased acreage at prices reflecting the land's sheep grazing value rather than its eventual residential and commercial development potential, the 93,000 acres that would become the Irvine Ranch were worth approximately $150,000. The transformation of that agricultural holding into the most valuable privately held real estate portfolio in the United States is a story that spans 6 generations of family ownership, the post-World War II suburbanization of Southern California, the establishment of the University of California, Irvine as an anchor institution in 1965, and Donald Bren's specific financial and development vision that has governed the property since his 1977 acquisition of a controlling interest. The specific financial innovation that distinguishes the Irvine Company's development model from the leveraged real estate development models this channel has documented across its archive is the relationship between land ownership and development financing. The Irvine Company owns the land permanently and finances the development, the buildings, the infrastructure, the amenities through project-level debt whose maturity is calibrated to the project's cash flow rather than to the land's value. The land itself is not pledged as collateral in the conventional sense. It is held permanently, with the development on top of it, financed and refinanced as market conditions permit, but never in a structure where a financing failure would require the land's sale. This is the specific structural innovation that the permanent mortgage philosophy represents, the separation of land ownership from development financing, so that the development financing's potential failure, which happens continuously in real estate markets, never reaches the underlying landholding whose permanent ownership is the source of the portfolio's value. Every private equity real estate acquisition this channel has documented uses the land as collateral for the acquisition debt. When the acquisition debt fails, the land is sold. The Irvine Company has structured its portfolio so that the development debt's failure would produce development losses, but not land sales, and the land's permanent appreciation is what has made Donald Bren one of the wealthiest people in the United States. The development model that the Irvine Company has applied to its 9,300-acre Orange County holding reflects the specific advantages that permanent land ownership provides in a development context. The ability to develop the land on a timeline calibrated to market demand, rather than to a debt maturity schedule. The ability to retain the completed development's income stream, rather than selling it to realize equity returns. And the ability to absorb market cycle downturns without the forced sale pressure that debt maturity creates. The master plan community model that the Irvine Company has used to develop its land, a coordinated development of residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, office parks, retail centers, and amenity infrastructure whose design is managed centrally rather than through individual parcel sales, produces a development outcome that individual parcel development cannot achieve. A built environment whose components are mutually reinforcing rather than independently optimize, generating the community quality premium that has made Irvine, California one of the most consistently desirable residential markets in the United States for more than 4 decades. The community quality premium is not separable from the permanent ownership model. It requires an owner who controls enough land to manage the community's development holistically, who has the time horizon to invest in infrastructure and amenity before the demand that justifies the investment has fully materialized, and who is not under pressure to sell individual parcels at the highest available price, rather than at the price that best supports the community's long-term value. These are not characteristics available to a developer whose land is financed with acquisition debt that matures in 5 to 7 years. They are available only to an owner whose relationship with the land is permanent rather than transactional. An owner who will still own the land when the investment matures, whenever that turns out to be. Donald Bren's net worth, estimated at approximately $17 billion, is substantially the accumulated expression of what it means to own irreplaceable California land permanently, develop it on the market's timeline rather than debt's timeline, and retain the income it generates rather than selling the assets that produce it. The institutional resilience that the Irvine Company has demonstrated across 50 years of ownership and development reflects a specific financial discipline whose most important element is the one that sounds the least like conventional financial strategy: the explicit refusal to optimize for exit. Every private equity real estate model this channel has documented is organized around exit. The acquisition is structured to produce a return at sale within a specified holding period, and the operational decisions made during the holding period are evaluated against their contribution to the exit period value, rather than against their contribution to the long-term value of the underlying asset. The Irvine Company is organized around the opposite principle. The portfolio is structured to never require an exit, and the operational decisions made across the portfolio's development are evaluated against their contribution to the long-term value of the underlying landholding, rather than against any exit period financial metric. That orientation produces operational decisions that look irrational from an exit optimization perspective and that are rational from a permanent ownership perspective. Infrastructure investments that will take 20 years to be reflected in land values. Amenity developments that improve community quality without generating direct income returns. Development timing that prioritizes market readiness over debt maturity urgency. The Irvine Company's development of the Irvine Spectrum Center, the Great Park neighborhoods, and the managed development of Irvine as one of the safest and most highly rated mid-sized cities in the United States are the specific expressions of what permanent ownership real estate development produces when the owner has the capital, the land control, and the time horizon to implement it. Every developer in this channel's archive had access to capital and to land. None of them had the time horizon. The time horizon is what the permanent mortgage philosophy provides and what the leveraged buyout's exit obligation permanently removes. This is not a model available to most investors. It requires an initial land position whose scale and irreplaceability make permanent ownership rational, a condition that the 1864 Irvine Ranch acquisition created and that no subsequent market transaction has been able to replicate. But it is the model that works. And every case file in this channel's archive is partly the story of what happens when investors attempt to generate the returns of permanent ownership through the mechanism of leveraged temporary ownership instead. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication.